Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Hello.
Today we're doing exactly that, plunging into a stack of information centered on one major topic: the tariffs implemented during the second Trump administration.
Yeah, and our source for this is a pretty detailed analysis. It covers the planning, key events, the legal challenges, and the impacts of these trade actions. Gives a comprehensive look.
And our mission: to take everything in this source and really unpack the timeline of events, try to understand the policies, see how countries and different sectors reacted.
And grasp the immediate economic and legal fallout.
Exactly. It's all about getting to the core of this complex period based only on the details shared in this material. Ready to jump in?
Absolutely, let's do it. This source tells us the second Trump term kicked off on January 20th, 2025. And right away, there was this pledge to immediately begin the overhaul of our trade system.
And they moved fast. The source notes that by February 1st, they declared national emergencies. These were related to issues like fentanyl trafficking and border security.
Right, and this became the hook, the mechanism to impose immediate 25% tariffs on most goods from Mexico and Canada, and 10% on goods from China.
But it wasn't static, was it? Things changed quickly.
Very quickly. What's interesting is those tariffs on Mexican and Canadian goods, the ones that complied with the USMCA trade agreement, they were suspended fairly fast.
Okay.
And the source highlights this: the fentanyl tariff specifically on Chinese goods actually increased. It went up to 20% just a few weeks later on March 4th.
And around that same time, this idea of reciprocal tariff started floating around, February 13th.
Yeah, that was floated for any country with trade barriers against the U.S., and you can imagine that sent foreign diplomats scrambling, trying to figure out negotiations.
So that February announcement was really just a preview.
Exactly. The source marks April 2nd as a really pivotal day. It was referred to as Liberation Day.
Liberation Day, okay.
This was when Trump announced these reciprocal tariffs would apply to, virtually all U.S. imports from countries that weren't specifically exempted.
And this wasn't a minor adjustment. We're talking a baseline 10% tariff starting April 5th for most countries.
But higher rates, much higher in some cases, were imposed on 57 specific nations.
And the rationale, according to the source's description of the administration's formula, it was this view that trade deficits are inherently bad.
That seems to be the core idea presented, that trade deficits are harmful. But the source really flags the criticism here.
Right.
Many economists apparently argue this view, and the formula itself, were based on a, quote, flawed understanding of trade, called it overly simplistic. The source even cites one economist saying his own research was actually misinterpreted to justify these policies.
Wow.
And some critics make analogies, like worrying about trade deficits is like worrying about having a deficit with your grocery store. You know, you buy more from them.
Sure, you buy groceries, they don't buy much from you. It's normal.
Exactly. The source even mentions some media pointed out it was the same formula you could get from certain AI models at the time.
Okay, so if the idea was reciprocal, if on deficits, how did that actually translate into the tariff rates for those 57 countries? Was it just random?
No, not random according to the source. It explains the formula they used, essentially linked the tariff percentage directly to the trade deficit with that specific country.
I see.
So if you look at the table in the source material, the rates varied wildly, from 11% all the way up to 50% for those 57 targeted countries. And that was on top of the 10% baseline for everyone else.
Any examples stand out?
Yeah, the source points out Lesotho, a country Trump reportedly said nobody had ever heard of, and Cambodia faced the highest rates, 50% and 49% respectively.
Okay, so beyond those standard tariffs, the source also talks about changes to something called the de minimis exemption. What exactly is that, and why was closing it such a big deal?
Right, de minimis, it basically lets low-value packages skip formal customs procedures and duties. It's really crucial for e-commerce companies.
Like Shein and AliExpress.
Exactly, those kinds of companies shipping lots of small orders directly from places like China. The source says this exemption was initially closed for Mexico, Canada, and China back in February.
Okay.
Then it was briefly reopened and then slammed shut again, specifically for China and Hong Kong on April 2nd, that Liberation Day.
And what happened when that fast lane closed? What was the impact?
It meant those shipments suddenly faced massive duties. For postal shipments from China or Hong Kong, the source says they'd face either 120% of the value or a minimum of $100 per package.
Per package, wow.
Yeah. Shipments via other carriers faced the standard duties, starting around 145% or even higher. And that's why, according to the source, Temu reportedly just stopped selling directly from China.
Makes sense.
And the administration apparently planned to close this de minimis route for all countries eventually.
This all sounds like things were escalating incredibly fast. What happened next? Did things calm down?
Not exactly. Things definitely got rocky. The source notes that on April 9th, just a few days after the baseline started, the tariffs on those 57 trading partners actually briefly spiked even higher than announced.
Higher? How high?
Between 11% and 50%, depending on the country. But, and this is key, they were suspended within hours for all countries except China.
Suspended within hours. Why the sudden reversal for almost everyone?
The source points directly to concerns over crashing stock and bond markets. It seems the immediate negative market reaction forced a really rapid reconsideration for most trading partners.
But not for China.
Not for China.
And that led to a significant back and forth with China, didn't it? A real escalation.
It did. The source describes it specifically as a retaliatory spiral. U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods surged up to 145%.
145%.
And China responded, raising its tariffs on U.S. goods to 125%.
And these were layered on top of other tariffs already in place, right? Like steel and aluminum.
Exactly. The source reminds us the 25% tariff on steel and aluminum from March 12th and the 25% tariff on automobiles from April 3rd, those were still active.
So cumulatively.
Right. According to Politico, as cited in the source, all these combined tariffs pushed the average effective U.S. tariff rate up to 27%, which apparently was the highest level seen in over a century.
A century. Okay, so what was the real world impact? Were people feeling this yet?
Well, the source highlights warnings coming from CEOs of major U.S. retailers in late April. They were telling Wall Street this escalating trade war, especially with China, would soon lead to noticeable price increases and product shortages on store shelves.
When did that happen?
It seems like it started to. By May, when the first cargo ships arrived facing those massive 145% tariffs, the source notes shipments were already cut in half.
It sounds like maybe there were different opinions even within the administration on how to handle this whole thing.
That's what the source suggests. It reports on a shift in economic advisors around this time. Peter Navarro, known as a staunch protectionist, was reportedly sidelined.
Okay.
While Scott Bessent, who apparently saw tariffs more as a negotiation tool, was promoted, Navarro's goal seemed to be a fundamental transformation of trade relationships.
Right, the reciprocal idea.
Whereas Bessent was maybe more focused on using tariffs just to gain leverage in talks. But the source states that ultimately, Trump adopted Navarro's core reciprocal tariff idea. That's what got implemented.
Got it. Amidst all this tension and escalation, was any progress actually made on trade deals? Any de-escalation?
Well, the source mentions a limited trade deal was reached with the UK on May 8th. It cut some tariffs, but importantly, largely kept that 10% minimum baseline in place.
So even with a deal, the baseline stayed.
Seems so. The very next day, Trump reportedly stated that 10% baseline would remain for all countries, even after any negotiations.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Setting aside the economic impact for a moment, how did the administration actually implement these tariffs so quickly? What was the legal basis, and what were the consequences?
This is a really crucial part. The source explains the administration used some pretty unprecedented legal authority. They invoked powers under the National Emergencies Act and also the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA.
By declaring emergencies related to, what was it? Trade deficits, border security.
Exactly, among others. And using these emergency powers allowed them to enact the tariffs extremely quickly. It effectively let them bypass the usual congressional procedures for setting trade duties.
That sounds controversial.
It definitely was, according to the source. It notes that while IEPA had been used before, mainly for things like sanctions and emergencies, it had never been used like this to impose broad tariffs on goods.
So critics must have pushed back.
Oh yeah. Critics, including economists and legal experts mentioned in the source, saw these emergency declarations as, well, perhaps fabricated, specifically to justify imposing tariffs without getting the congressional approval that the Constitution usually requires for trade policy.
And what was the reaction in Congress itself? Did they try to stop it?
The source reports that Democratic representatives did attempt to use privileged resolutions, a specific legislative tool to end these national emergencies.
Like?
They were blocked by the Republican majority. The source even mentions J.D. Vance casting a tie-breaking vote in the Senate, specifically allowing the Liberation Day tariffs emergency to continue.
So if Congress couldn't stop it, did anyone else challenge these moves legally? Businesses, states.
Absolutely. The source details numerous legal challenges pouring in. Companies, business groups, trade associations, lawyers, even foreign governments filed formal complaints.
Okay.
And it wasn't just private groups. Think about this. State governments started suing the federal government over tariffs.
State governments suing. Why would they get involved in federal trade policy?
That's what the source highlights as particularly noteworthy. California filed a lawsuit on April 16th. Then, just a week later, 12 other states joined in on April 23rd.
And their argument?
Their challengers argued that the tariffs were illegal, essentially saying these federal trade actions were overstepping authority or were illegally harming their state interests and economies.
Were there other significant lawsuits happening?
Yes, the source mentions a public interest law firm also sued. This was on behalf of small businesses in a case called VOS Selections, Inc. v. Trump. Their argument was straightforward. The tariffs were unlawful.
Did they try to stop them immediately?
They asked for a temporary halt, but the source says that initial request was denied. Still, it indicates this case was a central one among the early legal challenges.
So a lot of legal action. What was the outcome, at least according to the source, during this period? Was there a ruling?
Yes, there's a key date provided, May 28th.
Okay.
The source states that on this date, a panel of judges on the United States Court of International Trade handed down a ruling. They ruled that Trump had overstepped his authority on most of the Liberation Day tariffs. They effectively blocked them from going into effect.
Wow, so the courts intervened significantly.
Based on the source's reporting, yes. It shows the legal challenges were not just noise, they were significant, and in this instance reported, successful in court.
How were lawmakers even finding out about some of these nature decisions? Was communication smooth?
Apparently not always. The source mentions that politically, lawmakers were sometimes frustrated because they learned about major tariff decisions, via social media.
Seriously?
Yeah, which points to maybe a breakdown in the usual communication channels, as described in the source. Democratic Senator Adam Schiff, for instance, reportedly called for an investigation into potential insider trading or market manipulation. Linked to these really abrupt tariff announcements and reversals, the media, according to the source, described the whole situation as creating an unprecedented crisis of trust in how the government was handling the economy.
Okay, so that covers the legal and political side. Let's go back to the international reaction. How did individual countries respond when they got hit with these tariffs?
The source gives quite a few specific examples. For Canada and Mexico, remember those initial February tariffs? They were explicitly linked to concerns about illegal immigration and fentanyl smuggling.
Right.
Mexico responded, according to the source, by stepping up its anti-narco-traffic efforts. They even handed over some cartel prisoners.
Did that help with the tariffs?
Well, eventually, the USMCA-compliant goods were delayed from the tariffs, but companies still had to scramble to prove compliance. Canada, for its part, imposed its own retaliatory tariffs, but then held off on implementing planned increases later.
And China. Beyond that initial retaliatory spiral, what else did they do?
The source notes China fought back not just with tariffs, but also with non-tariff barriers. Things like blacklisting U.S. companies, imposing export controls on rare earths, which are critical materials for tech and defense industries, and revoking export licenses for U.S. goods. They also significantly cut imports of U.S. oil, turning to Canada for supplies instead.
So hitting back in multiple ways.
Definitely. And the source also points out something interesting. In the face of these tariffs, China, South Korea, and Japan actually met on March 30th. They discussed strengthening free trade and supply chain cooperation among themselves.
Kind of a united front then. But later, the source mentioned the U.S. did cut some tariffs on Chinese goods.
Yes, a bit of de-escalation reported later. The source says following trade talks in May, the U.S. did cut tariffs on most Chinese goods down to 30%, and even reduced the duties on those de minimis shipments, bringing them down to 54%. Still high, but lower.
Okay. Who were some of the other countries that were heavily impacted or had notable reactions?
Well, India, despite actually having a trade surplus with the U.S., was famously labeled the Tariff King by Trump.
I remember that.
The source cites analyses projecting a really significant economic impact there, potentially affecting 87% of its exports to the U.S., valued at $66 billion. Pharmaceuticals and auto parts were mentioned as particularly vulnerable.
Did India propose anything?
They proposed a 0 for 0 tariff idea specifically for auto parts.
What about Israel, a close ally?
Israel faced a 17% tariff. And the source notes that even despite offers from Israel to remove its own tariffs on U.S. goods and a visit by Prime Minister Netanyahu, Trump declined to remove the U.S. duty.
In Japan, you mentioned market reactions earlier.
They definitely felt it. The source reports that notable fall in the Japanese stock market, the Nikkei 225, dropped 7.8%. Analysts were estimating a decrease in Japan's GDP because of tariffs on cars and other goods. And the U.S., according to the source, refused Japan's request for a full exemption.
How did leaders in other parts of Asia view this, like Singapore or Vietnam?
Singapore's prime minister, quoted in the source, had strong words, described the U.S. actions as rejecting the very system it created and speeding up the fracturing of the global economy.
Strong words indeed.
Singapore even announced a task force to help its businesses navigate the whole situation. Vietnam, meanwhile, was hit really hard, according to the source. A surprisingly high 46% tariff, described as shocking,
And the effect?
caused its stock market to crash. And despite Vietnam making diplomatic efforts, even offering to eliminate all its own import tariffs on U.S. goods, a Trump advisor reportedly rejected the deal. The quote was something like, "It's the non-tariff cheating that matters."
Were there any unexpected reactions, countries doing something different?
Yes, actually. Interestingly, the source mentions Zimbabwe. On April 6th, they became the first country to scrap tariffs on all U.S. goods, as a goodwill gesture.
A goodwill gesture amid all this tension. How did a country like Australia handle it? Retaliate? Negotiate?
Australia's prime minister, according to the source, definitely opted for negotiation rather than retaliation. They even released a strategy document outlining ways to mitigate the damage from the tariffs.
Did they align with China?
No, the source says they specifically declined China's reported offer to join hands in opposing the U.S. They also apparently considered reopening trade talks with the European Union after hearing about Trump's 100% tariff on film.
Okay, what about, say, Brazil or Fiji? Any details there?
Fiji initially seemed worried about a global trade war, but then later speculated the tariffs might actually bring some odd benefits, like cheaper goods from countries needing to offload excess capacity. Eventually, they were confirmed for tariff talks with the U.S.
And Brazil. They have a big economy.
Brazil, despite having a trade surplus with the U.S., was criticized by Trump. Their president initially vowed to reciprocate any tariffs, but the institutional affairs minister later clarified that Brazil would not retaliate, at least not on the steel and aluminum tariffs specifically.
Okay, we've looked at a lot of individual countries. Stepping back again, what were the broader economic impacts of all this, based on what's in the source?
The source details pretty significant ripple effects across the board. The onset of this intensified trade war triggered immediate stock market declines, really sharp ones.
Yikes.
This included, according to the source, the second largest daily point loss ever for the S&P 500 and the largest ever point loss for the NASDAQ composite. That was around April 2nd and 3rd. Early trading in Japan also triggered circuit breakers because things were so volatile.
And it affected more than just stocks, right? Bonds, the dollar.
Yes. The source notes concerns started popping up about the U.S.'s long-held status as a safe haven in the bond market. There was also talk of a confidence crisis in the U.S. dollar, meaning other major currencies like the euro and the yen surged against it. Some economists cited in the source even went as far as predicting a U.S. recession in 2025 as a direct result of these actions.
Were supply chains actually disrupted? We heard warnings.
Definitely seems like it. As those shipments from China plummeted because of the high tariffs, the source indicates supply shortages started looming large. Industries that relied heavily on Chinese goods, like medical devices, were facing significant chokeholds in their supply chains.
And how did U.S. businesses react on the ground?
Well, corporate America, including big consumer goods companies, issued pretty stark warnings to Wall Street about the damage they expected.
Any specific company examples?
The source gives a few. Mack Trucks and Volvo announced layoffs. Some auto companies like Audi, Jaguar, and Land Rover just suspended exports to the U.S. entirely because of the automobile tariffs.
Wow.
Even Nintendo reportedly delayed U.S. pre-orders for their new Switch 2 console, specifically citing the tariff uncertainty.
That really shows the breadth of the impact.
Yeah.
Was there concern about even bigger global economic problems, like debt crises?
There was. One economist cited in the source argued the tariffs had the potential to really disrupt the whole global economy's balance of payments.
Unpack that a little.
Basically, if countries earned fewer dollars because they were selling less to the U.S. due to tariffs, it could make it much harder for them to pay back debts they owed in dollars, which could potentially lead to a debt crisis for some of those nations.
And finally, what about the impact closer to home on U.S. consumers?
The source does briefly mention estimates that these tariffs would impose direct costs on U.S. families, presumably through higher prices for goods or maybe just less availability.
We have certainly covered a tremendous amount of ground in this deep dive, looking at the tariffs of the second Trump administration, all based strictly on the source material provided.
Yeah, we've tracked the timeline from those initial emergency declarations, unpacked that controversial reciprocal tariff formula,
Gone through the escalation, the really varied reactions from countries all over the world.
seen the significant economic impacts in markets and supply chains, and also the legal challenges that, according to the source, ultimately blocked some of the tariffs.
It's really clear from this source that these policies, justified under national emergencies and explicitly aimed at addressing trade deficits, created just widespread uncertainty and incredibly complex consequences globally.
Yeah, impacting everything from whole national economies down to specific company decisions and potentially the prices consumers pay.
So, as you reflect on everything we've unpacked today, maybe consider this. The source vividly illustrates just how differently countries approached this situation. Some chose retaliation, others tried negotiation. One even made that surprising goodwill gesture by removing its own tariffs. And then you had legal challenges coming not just internationally, but from states and businesses within the U.S. itself. Based only on what we've learned from this source material, what does this diverse spectrum of responses really reveal about the interconnected nature of the global trade system today? And perhaps what does it suggest about the inherent complexities and maybe the limits